back to Gladio Free Europe. We are here to continue the riveting story of the LA Times bombing. Where we last left off, the Los Angeles Times building had just been reduced to a smoldering wreck. A bomb placed by the International Association of Bridge, Structural, Ornamental, and Reinforcing Ironworkers ignited the natural gas lines in the basement beneath the print shop, immediately punching a hole in the downtown LA skyline.
The LA Times building wasn't chosen by accident. The Ironworkers, a subsidiary of the American Federation of Labor, whose ranks included professed anarchists and communists, had been waging a years-long battle against California captains of industry. Perhaps the most ruthlessly anti-labor of these captains was Harrison Gray Otis and Harry Chandler, the owner and manager of the LA Times. Otis was a former U.S. Army general who had lived in a mansion called the Bivouac and had a real cannon mounted on the hood of his car. Harry Chandler, his partner and son-in-law, was a passionate eugenicist.
Right. The same saboteur who placed the bomb at the LA Times building had placed another one at General Otis's house, the Bivouac, and one more at the residence of the man who ran the LA Chamber of Commerce. And so, in the early hours of October 1st, 1910, the timer on the first of these bombs hit 0. The LA Times building was immediately engulfed in flames. The presence of gas meant it was a much more dangerous explosion than anticipated. About 20 people were immediately blown to pieces. Some others died later from burns suffered in the ensuing fire, and well over 100 were injured. This bombing was the deadliest terror attack in U.S. history up to this point, and the bomber was J.B. McNamara, a young Irish-American with a troubled past, who maintained for the rest of his life that he never intended to hurt anybody. This claim would be fiercely contested in his upcoming trial, and that trial is going to be a big part of this week's Gladio Free Europe episode. Because although J.J. McNamara was now hiding hundreds of miles away in Union-friendly San Francisco, he had unknowingly left a trail that would lead the authorities straight back to him.
One of the other so-called infernal devices left by J.B. McNamara did not go off. Falling into the hands of the police and a wily private detective, it was matched to an identical bomb that had failed to detonate about a month prior in Illinois. Although authorities didn't know it yet, both bombs had a connection to Orty McManigal, a union man turned into a reluctant saboteur by the Ironworkers executive Herbert Hawken. The story quickly became national news, and many in the labor movement came to believe that the bombing was a false flag operation orchestrated by Otis himself. One of the union men who insisted on their innocence was J.J. McNamara, the elder brother of the bomber. Got all those names? Well, strap in, because the manhunt is on, and like the trial that followed it, it would be dirty as all hell.
You might remember from the end of the last episode that a guy named William J. Burns, the so-called and possibly self-proclaimed American Sherlock Holmes, jumped on the investigation immediately. Burns is a great character. Failed actor with an incredible memory. And when he realized he could never make it on stage, he began to do detective work for the Secret Service. He also had a great knack for getting his name out there, including by writing fiction about himself under a pen name to spread the word about his real and fictitious deeds. By 1910, he had many different successes under his belt, including a previous investigation in San Francisco, which locked up a friend of General Otis, earning Burns the score of the latter. But we'll get to that in a second. In a stroke of luck, Burns was already familiar with the handiwork behind the unexploded bomb left by J.B. McNamara, because in September of 1910, he had been hired to investigate another device found in a railway yard in Peoria, Illinois. Most of the components were so generic that they were untraceable, but the nitroglycerin can was traced back to a company in neighboring Indiana. And so, following this bizarrely coincidental lead, Burns received a description of the man who had put in the order, using the name McGraw. This McGraw was no other than Orty McManigal. If you remember from our last episode, McManigal was an explosives expert who grew up as a child working in the dynamite mines of Ohio and had done over 150 sabotage jobs for the ironworkers in just 3 years. Burns didn't yet make this connection, but the mysterious device lingered in his memory.
Barely a month later, when the LA Times bombing happened, Burns hopped on a train to Los Angeles to get in on the investigation. His fame preceded him massively, and the city rolled out the red carpet for the famous detective. When he was shown the unexploded device, he was discovered that it was, quote, identical in every detail to the unexploded bomb in Peoria, except for the use of 16 sticks of 80% dynamite instead of nitroglycerin. Burns was able to secure a bounty of $100,000, that's around $3.2 million in today's money, from the mayor of Los Angeles, Alexander, to undertake a private investigation. It was a really unusual arrangement. He was allowed to keep the evidence to himself. Thanks to identifying evidence found on the dynamite, Burns was quickly able to track down the manufacturer and secure descriptions of J.B. McNamara's collaborators. This was Schmitty and Kaplan. These guys were hardcore anarchists we mentioned in the last episode, who just could not keep their mouths shut. And Schmitty, he had a very galling effect on people because he had a glass eye that was always looking in the opposite direction of his real eye. But
yeah. So by the time Burns got around to this investigation, all of those culprits had left LA. But Burns quickly found some evidence leading to San Francisco, culminating in the discovery of a 500-pound cache of dynamite hidden in an unassuming cabin. But then after this discovery, Burns vanished. Nobody knew where he was, because he was going to continue the investigation entirely privately from this point forward, fearing not only that he would be discovered by the men he was trying to capture, but also that another investigator might pick up on the same clues he'd found and then claim the reward before he could. Anyway, Burns' sleuthing led him to an anarchist commune called the Home Colony in Washington State, where J.B. McNamara had previously sought explosive advice during a previous stint in California. Burns' men learned that at that time, J.B. had with him some dynamite from the same company that Orty McManigal had patronized earlier. These two cases were now undeniably tied together, but the trail turned cold until treachery ran its head. You jump in here?
Yeah. Just to add a funny addendum, this commune disbanded in 1919 because of a heated disagreement about nude swimming, which was called the battle between the nudes and the prudes.
All right, that's great. But hey, before we get any further, let's see what J.B. McNamara was up to. Because at this time, like we said, he'd skipped town. He immediately tried to seek shelter with those friends of his in San Francisco. But these guys knew that he was red hot. If they sheltered him, any of them could suddenly become become involved in this investigation. So, and any association with a known terrorist could potentially bring down the San Francisco labor movement. So in a scene not dissimilar from Henry Hill in the third act of Goodfellas, JB spent a paranoid week in San Francisco, doing whatever he could to avoid danger and spending all the money he had in alcohol and women. Around this time, he read news coverage of the event, which he learned was in fact the deadliest terror attack in US history. What disturbed him most was the fact that there was a death toll at all, 19, initially misreported as 21. He claimed he never thought his bomb would kill anybody. And although Lou Irwin, writer of the book Deadly Times that we're sourcing a lot of this episode from, disputes that, I think that's most likely the case, because this guilt would animate J.B. McNamara throughout the ensuing manhunt and trial, and ultimately, in a sense, bring down the entire case. But at this point, J.B. was a broken man. J.B. was so racked with guilt that he ended up fleeing California altogether, all the way to Nebraska, to stay with his mother. He pled for JJ, his brother, to come visit him, but that would be too dangerous. Eventually, a mutual friend in the Ironworkers Guild saw JB, who at this point had suffered such a severe case of alcoholism and had lost so much weight that he was completely unrecognizable. This friend then lied in a letter to JJ that his brother was doing fine.
Yeah, but in truth, he was anything but. He was concocting all kinds of frightening schemes at this time. JJ himself refused to visit his brother for fear of getting rolled up. And instead, the man he sent in his stead had to listen to JB's ravings, one of which included JB trying to convince him to plant a bomb on the crowded train to kill a stenographer who he feared knew too much about the case.
Right, it's Ray Liotta looking up and seeing the helicopters.
Yeah, exactly. It was really clear to all that he was teetering on the edge of insanity. So, pitying his brother, JJ asked McManigal to take JB along on a hunting trip to Wisconsin. This would prove to be a mistake.
Right. You guys might remember someone named Herbert Hawken in the last episode. He was a sleazy union guy, an accused serial child molester, who had originally strong-armed Orty McManigal into becoming a bomber. His responsibilities within the union had been reduced after it was learned that he'd been pocketing part of McManigal's pay for years. But they couldn't get rid of him entirely because he knew too much. And know too much he did, because without the knowledge of the rest of the union, Hawken was secretly feeding information to a consortium of construction companies whom the Union had been striking against, the people that were the targets of the bombing. Due to this, by November, just a month after the bombing, he was introduced to Burns, the detective. And at this meeting, he revealed the crucial information that the enigmatic McGraw, the man who had bought that material in Indiana for the attack on Peoria, Illinois, was in fact Horty McManigal. At first, Burns was suspicious of Hawken's intentions. He wasn't a fan of snitches.
What is he up to, this smarmy double-crosser? Burns must have thought. Money? He decided to test him. He hired Hawken as a, quote, special investigator to keep tabs on the activity of the ironworkers' leaders. No need to pay me, Hawken replied. His words astonished Burns, but only for a split second, for Hawken quickly added, I just want to be reimbursed for expenses. At the moment, Burns had no knowledge of Hawken's talent for expense account padding. By the end of their meeting, Burns had agreed to protect Hawken if he should ever be jailed by the authorities. He would pay him $2,500 a year for 2 years upon his release.
Right, and so Hawken revealed that McManigal was going to meet up with JB, now living under the assumed name Frank Sullivan, on that hunting trip we mentioned. Burns had the pieces to bring it all together. Accordingly, Burns' men traced McManigal from Chicago to Wisconsin, where this expert bomb maker was finally reunited with the man who'd placed his bomb, JB. But JB's instability was immediately apparent, and he would swing wildly between remorse and bombast about the attack. One day, McManigal claimed, JB had taken a shot in McManigal's direction, ostensibly because he'd seen a rabbit, but McManigal was worried this might indicate some darker intentions. A few days later into the trip, McManigal's group also became friendly with another group of hunters. These men seemed awfully interested in JB and enticed him with their large cache of whiskey. They were, it would turn out, those spies sent by William Burns. McManigal was always a suspicious guy, and his fears weren't helped by the fact that they kept trying to get JB to pose for pictures. McManigal chastised JB for this, and although they didn't stop hanging out with these guys, he was really much more careful about not getting his picture taken, always moving his face slightly so the photo would come out blurred. That's the kind of thing you could do back then, right? When it took like 10 minutes to pose for a picture. But eventually, however, his luck would run out.
Yeah, Gu Irwin writes in his book Deadly Times that on yet another occasion, while reprovisioning in Conover with JB, the Burns men were approached by a young mother McNamara had been dating, who asked if one of the detectives would take a picture of her with JB. While he demurred, feigning shyness, the girl insisted that the picture of her 2-year-old daughter be taken with her boyfriend holding the child in his arms. In a single abrupt motion, the girl handed the toddler over and stood at JB's side in an impromptu family-like pose, not quite believing his sudden luck. The detective took a few steps back and steadied his camera. The hapless JB found himself trapped with his girlfriend's child squirming in his lap as the detective quickly counted down. On 3, 1, 2, and on 3, JB once again moved his head.
Although the picture was slightly blurred, it was clear enough that Burns was able to corroborate that JB was the same man who introduced himself under an assumed name in San Francisco. McManigal's party would slink out of the hunting grounds one day early in the morning, before the detectives could get in their trail, but their identities were now known. The two were allowed to remain free in the meantime, lest their arrest interfere with the investigation into the ironworkers' higher executives, but they were living on borrowed time.
Meanwhile, Burns emerged from his occultation after a month's absence, barging into Mayor Alexander's Los Angeles home with nothing more than a few blurry photographs of JB and demanding yet more money for the investigation. Authorities in LA were beginning to get antsy and refused to forward funding unless Burns submitted daily reports of his investigations. He refused, and he continued to fund the investigation out of his own pocket, nearly becoming bankrupt in the process. After JB returned to Chicago, he just so happened to run into one of the men from the other hunting party. By this point, it was undeniable that there was something off about that group. McManigal and JB traveled to Indianapolis to meet with JJ and told him about the suspicious hunting party that they had encountered. JJ, surprisingly, was thrilled. He figured that since no action had been taken against JB or himself, Burns had nothing. But just to be sure, JJ sent McManigal to California to do another bombing campaign to draw the heat off his brother. This time, McManigal was to target some ironworks, as well as the new LA Times printing press, which was recently purchased to replace the one that had just been destroyed.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of like in the second Star Wars, where at the end of it, they're building the new Death Star.
Yeah, kind of. McManigal was reluctant, but he did as he was told, and on December 9th, which, just to remind you guys, was only 2 months after the LA Times bombing. He packed his bags full of nitroglycerin and departed on his so-called vacation. He spent weeks moonlighting as a tourist before finally setting up infernal machines at one of the ironworks on Christmas Eve. He had ascertained that the other 2 targets were too heavily guarded for McManigal to hit. McManigal then boarded the night train to San Francisco. The bomb had blown a hole in the building but did not demolish it. When he dropped in to visit San Francisco labor leaders, he decided to have some fun.
As Irwin puts it, in the late afternoon of December 26th, Ordy McManigal dropped by the Union Labor Temple in San Francisco to pay a call to Olaf Tveitmo, the Big Chief, as he called him, and a guy named Eugene Clancy. Tveitmo, he was told, was not expected, but he did find Clancy, whom he'd never met before. McManigal was in such high spirits on this day that he decided to play a practical joke on the Union leader. Pretending to be a police detective, he told Clancy, "I've come to get the Los Angeles dynamiters." Clancy paled. McManigal then roared with laughter, introducing himself, and told Clancy, "Tell the old man that his Christmas present has been delivered."
I would simply not joke like that to a bunch of shady Union guys.
Well, a few weeks after this, McManigal was called to see JJ again at Indianapolis, which we should add was where the headquarters of the ironworkers were based. JJ McNamara was livid that only one of the targets was hit. As McManigal recounted, it was at this point that he began to feel disenchanted with JJ McNamara. By now, JJ was beginning to show the same unhinged proclivities as his brother, first suggesting a campaign of mail bombings, which could detonate aboard trains, and next, something that's really straight out of like a comic book supervillain arc.
Quote, he would send both JB and McManigal to Los Angeles and have them plant a number of infernal machines along the new aqueduct under construction and principal water mains. They would be set to go off simultaneously. A few minutes later, a number of fires would be ignited in key locations all over town. A few minutes later, a number of fires would be ignited in a few key locations all over town, set off by timing devices. Without water to put them out, said JJ, quote, the whole Scab City would be wiped off the map.
Yeah, pretty crazy stuff. And honestly, that might not even be their most wild scheme they entertained at this point. Because really, remember, just for some context here, the labor unions have been fighting a really fierce battle against the leaders of Los Angeles for several years, because the leaders of Los Angeles sought to basically eradicate unionism across the state of California. It was already nearly illegal to have a labor union in LA, and so they realized that they needed incredibly radical solutions to win the final victory over labor. Probably the most outrageous of all of these was when JJ considered sending Ordy McManigal down to Panama to blow up the canal that was about to open. This would surely be such a great moral victory for labor that it would inspire a world revolution. When McManigal said this would be impossible because there would have been US soldiers everywhere, JJ then said, well, that's fine, you can just join the army, and we'll try to pull some strings to get you sent down to Panama. But eventually, that also was shot down. They had one less grandiose, but much more underhanded plan to score a victory for the Unions, which was to murder Detective William Burns. McManigal was horrified at this suggestion. He refused vociferously. He'd plant bombs, he would do sabotage, but he would never deliberately kill someone. And again, we're seeing these two men, these old partners, JJ and Ordy, increasingly moving apart.
It was around this time that the same spies who had identified JJ McNamara's brother, JB, were able to track down McManigal after discovering that his wife Emma spent lots of time with a particular fortune teller in Chicago. They bribed this lady to tell them what she knew about the McManigal family. They had one other excellent asset in their hands. This was Herbert Hawken.
Right, because as we mentioned, he was the paid spy. At this point, he is formally introduced to Burns and these kind of two simultaneous investigations, one by the construction companies and one by the city of Los Angeles, with using William Burns, finally came together.
Right, because as a spy, Herb Hawken had encouraged the Union to be reckless and violent in order to help build an eventual criminal case against his own comrades.
And so because he was unable to draw further funding from the LA authorities, Burns was actually broke by April. He would have preferred to accumulate more evidence, but the financial pressure had gotten to him. And it was at this point that his spy Hawken informed him that McManigal and JB were now on their way to Detroit to bomb a new railway station built by non-union construction workers. Burns sent his son Raymond and some Chicago cops to Detroit to apprehend McManigal and the McNamara brothers. Both J.B. McNamara and Orty McManigal were apprehended as they checked their bags into the hotel in Detroit. Inside were revolvers, a rifle with a silencer, and 12 of those infernal machines, bombs, which had taken the nation by storm in these last few years. The pair were captured under the false pretense that they were suspected of participation in a safe-cracking ring in Chicago. On the way back to Chicago, J.B. cracked, telling Burns unprompted all he needed to know.
Quote, "You fellows don't want me for no safe blowing. Why, I never cracked a safe in my life. You want me for the Los Angeles job." McManigal tried to dissuade JB from speaking further, but he would not relent. Quote, "We can prove that it was caused by gas. Well, they'll never convict me if they take me back to that scabby fucking town in California." JB then tried to bribe his way out of his predicament, to no avail. McManigal kept his cool during the exchange, but the following day he would confess to his handiwork. It was the end of the line.
When the train finally reached Chicago, the pair were taken to the home of one of the officers who first made the arrest. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering, why weren't they booked? And the answer lies in the telegram William Burns sent to his LA office after the detainment. Have police department proceed immediately to Sacramento. Get extradition papers on Illinois, and come here quick as possible. We won't let arrest be known here until officers arrive with papers, or they would spend $100,000 on habeas corpus proceedings and all sorts of trouble. They offered us $30,000 to release them.
Yeah, just to break that down for you guys, what Burns was doing was insanely illegal. His entire plan involved depriving these men of their rights to ease the process. Here was a private detective detaining people for whom he had no warrants and transporting them across state lines outside of the confines of the law. These were the kinds of things that the labor movement would have to face on the regular back in those days, even when their actions did not have this kind of terroristic character. It was a dirty game from the get-go, and this was what honestly, this was what was most off-putting about the Irwin book, because although he compiles a great deal of really revealing evidence and he crafts a pretty good narrative, he just continues to both sides it the entire way through.
Yeah. No, and I get why, it's some people might have a lot of difficulty finding anyone who does a bombing finds them sympathetic, but yeah, I agree that he doesn't necessarily contextualize this trial as well as he could. And I think that he is almost kind of naive in some ways about how heartbroken he is when he finds about individual people doing small offenses like giving a bribe. While in captivity, JB and McManigal were kept in separate rooms and interrogated without the presence of the other one. And this is a classic police move. Quick tip for our listeners. If you're ever in any kind of legal trouble with accomplices, make sure to school them about the prisoner's dilemma before things get going. It can save you a lot of trouble down the line.
Yep. So in the house, JB was now playing mum and refused to restate his confession. Raymond Burns, that's the son of William Burns, then went to try his luck with McManigal, telling him to think of his wife and children, and that he stood to spend life behind bars, even if he was not involved in the LA Times bombing, because he was still part of a, quote, general murder conspiracy. Burns left Orty to ponder what he had told him, and after a brief period of about 20 minutes, McManigal decided that he would acquiesce. Raymond got his father to come to the house, and McManigal sang like a canary, and it would be weeks before the press got any whiff of this. Meanwhile, Burns' men were looking to seal their grip around JJ. They resorted to deception, placing a call to McManigal's wife Emma and telling her that Orty had asked her to go to a, quote, certain party and collect $500. That very night, she boarded a train to Indianapolis while being trailed by Burns' detectives and went straight into JJ's office to take the money. There was now direct evidence tying McManigal to JJ.
And back in LA, Burns sent a telegram to the DA, a guy named John Fredericks, saying that he now had the two McNamaras and McManigal in custody. This was completely untrue, but he wanted all the indictments to be processed together by the grand jury as a package deal, lest word got out about his game. The grand jury was convened in secret and did just as they were told, and extradition warrants followed on Friday, April 21st. And the following day, while the ironworkers' top brass had a meeting, cops burst down the door and JJ was detained. All present at the meeting were barred from leaving the room. A lawyer could not be reached by phone as it was Saturday evening. Burns and Indianapolis police then scoured the building in search of incriminating evidence. The search was momentarily halted when a lawyer finally waltzed into the building and told the police that their search warrant did not allow them to go into the basement. And while this was being arranged, Burns checked on a lead that McManigal had given him. He gave him the address of a barn where he'd stashed stolen dynamite at JJ's insistence. It was all right where he'd been told, over 540 pounds of it. When the search warrant came through, yet more dynamite was discovered in the basement, and more damningly, copies of JJ's correspondence with the bombing crew. McNamara was hauled before a judge for his arraignment. And despite the fact that Indiana law stipulated a defendant had the right to counsel, JJ was given no such consideration. He was to be extradited to California immediately. JJ was rushed into a car packed with LAPD officers and Burns' men, and sped to Terre Haute to get JJ on a train lest his extradition be legally delayed. Burns demanded that the car drive at top speed and to plow through any obstacles if necessary. The entourage boarded different trains until, just by chance, they ended up on the same car as Burns' son, McManigal, as well as J.B. McNamara.
News of the apprehension of the McNamaras and McManigal was finally allowed to air, but the men's innocence was taken for granted by large swaths of the public, as well as the labor movement. When McNamara's mother was asked by journalists for a comment, she gave an impassioned plea, quote, "How can I believe such things of my Johnny and Jimmy? Johnny has been such a good son, the very best in the world, and I have always been so proud of him. To appreciate the boy, one must know him. He is so clean and strong and fine. Wouldn't it be awful if they should hang my Johnny and Jimmy? Who can tell? They have hanged innocent men before, and only God knows what will happen to my two good boys."
The train took several days to reach California, with crowds gathering at each stop along the way hoping to capture a glimpse of the accused. Many of them came out in explicit support of the men who they believed to either be wrongly accused or justified in bombing the building. JB told one of his jailers, "I'd blow up the whole damn country if I thought it would get us rights." JJ, the smoother brother, maintained his composure during all of this. When journalists came aboard to ask him questions, he said, "It's an easy thing to manufacture evidence, but I'll be riding back the other way without any shackles soon." It was only toward the end of their journey, when the train finally reached California, that JB learned that McManigal had been cooperating with the authorities. His partner, his friend perhaps, was in fact one of the men who had turned him in.
So we've told a pretty crazy story so far, right? Well, buckle in, because the road is about to get a hell of a lot more bumpy.
That's right, because we are now getting into the second part of the episode, the trial, where things really get fun, especially because the prosecution team includes one of the most colorful characters in this episode. And this is an episode full of colorful characters. This guy is Earl Rogers, the whiskey-slamming lawyer, remembered today probably best for inventing the use of ballistic tests as courtroom evidence. This guy was a master at finding facts, a master at presenting them to the jury with theatrical flourishes. He would do things like weep on cue or pull out a scale diorama of a crime scene.
He was also an expert at manufacturing facts.
That's right, yeah. Because while he was renowned as a lawyer, he was notorious for his loose grip on the truth, just as he was notorious for his firm grasp on his bourbon flask. Because a couple years before this, there's a pretty good story here, a gambler known as the Louisville Sport was shot to death over a hand of cards on the idyllic island of Catalina. It's a lovely place if you've never been. Two pampered rich kids had been playing with him. Both of them were arrested, but nobody knew who had pulled the trigger that killed the Louisville Sport. And each of these two defendants accused the other guy of doing it. Well, Rogers ended up representing both of them in separate trials and managed to convince two subsequent juries that each defendant was in fact innocent and that the other guy had killed the Louisville Sport.
Rogers was so notorious for keeping clearly guilty men out of prison that his daughter told this story after his death. A local Chinese merchant had asked Rogers to defend him on a murder charge. When Rogers agreed, his new defendant bowed and thanked him, saying, "I go kill the man now, then I be back."
Yeah, so I think that was a little questionable personally, but it shows what kind of reputation this guy had as the not necessarily the cleanest lawyer in Los Angeles, but one of the most effective. He would be a great asset to either the prosecution or the defense. But much like General Otis and Harry Chandler, Earl Rogers was viscerally hostile to any left-wing causes. This is why he agreed to join the prosecution team, led by the much less colorful LA District Attorney John Fredericks. There's also one other interesting fact about Rogers, which was that he was intimately familiar with the corruption of the California business elite, as well as the violence that those men often used to maintain their power. We're getting into some real Chinatown stuff here. Because in 1907, Rogers defended city officials in San Francisco who were accused of taking bribes from railway companies to authorize the construction of the city's now famous cable cars. Prosecutors, hoping to find solid evidence, actually hired William Burns, the famous detective, who in 1910 would work alongside Earl Rogers on the bombing case. But this is 1907. And, William Burns, who is just as extravagant and as innovative as Earl Rogers, had a pretty clever way of proving that these men were in fact guilty.
What Burns did is he contacted one of the defendants with the promise of a new bribe, and in this way he was able to successfully implicate the San Francisco officials in an entirely new set of charges, as well as secure evidence that could be used in an ongoing prosecution. This was a huge disaster for Rogers, but the disaster was muted by a strange set of circumstances soon afterwards. The district attorney who led the charge alongside Burns was shot, apparently in retaliation for the investigation. He survived and the gunman was arrested, but before the would-be gunman could be tried or even interrogated, he was found murdered in his jail cell. What role Rogers played in all this will never be known.
And now, Earl Rogers is working with those same kinds of corrupt and violent officials as part of the prosecution, not the defense. He probably was uneasy working alongside William Burns given their past history, but they agreed that it was important to convict the McNamara brothers. I wonder also if tensions might have been exacerbated by Burns' grandstanding, because, he didn't want to be upstaged by this famous lawyer, Earl Rogers, so he claimed to the press this trial would actually not just implicate these McNamara brothers and Ordie McManigal, but in fact, potentially bring down the entire American Federation of Labor, led by the famous Samuel Gompers.
In the meantime, the entire labor movement was rallying behind the McNamaras. Most of the labor movement refused to believe that these men had actually set the bombs. McManigal was a family man, after all. J.J. McNamara was a clean-cut union official who had gotten a law degree through night school. Only the womanizing drunkard J.B. McNamara seemed to be a potential terrorist to newspaper readers, but even he had appeared to have cleaned up his act after joining the union cause.
Meanwhile, in D.C., AFL President Samuel Gompers sounded the alarm. How long are the American people going to stand for legalized kidnapping? Up goes the curtain with the blare of trumpets upon the first act of a tragedy, contemplating the assassination of organized labor. From what I know of Secretary McNamara, my faith and confidence in his innocence is unshaken by the charges against him. Famous socialist leader Eugene Debs, in fact, would one-up this rhetoric, saying that, "We must sound the alarm to the working class. The arrest of John McNamara, International Secretary of the Bridge and Structural Ironworkers, by a corporation detective agency has all the earmarks of another conspiracy to fasten the crime of murder upon labor union officials, to discredit and destroy organized labor in these United States." For this reason, both mainstream progressives and radical socialists pretty widely rallied behind these accused bombers. It was about quite similar to the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, but much earlier. Because they'd been tracked down and arrested through such sleazy means, many lawyers also believed that they could successfully defend these guys and make a name for themselves in the process. One of these lawyers rose to the top. The already famous middle-aged lawyer known for defending many civil rights and labor figures, Clarence Darrow.
We mentioned him in the first episode as an associate of many San Francisco labor leaders who surely supported the movement to extend labor organizations statewide, including down to Los Angeles. And Darrow was, if we're keeping count, also from Ohio. Now he had the opportunity to become a paladin for the working man, defending 3 unionists who had clearly been treated unfairly by crooked cops and a biased press. Darrow was middle-aged by this point and not in great health. In fact, he wanted to retire, but he made some bad investments, which forced him back into the game. He recognized that this could be his chance to win an incredible victory for labor at a great benefit to his own reputation, legacy, and pocketbook, because he was getting paid a lot of money by the unions all through this case, which would be raised through the rank and file.
And that's also something that I think that Lou Irwin sees as distasteful. He's not the biggest fan of Clarence Darrow. But by the time Darrow took this case, much of America, like we said, was totally convinced that these men were innocent. I don't know if Darrow personally believed that, but he certainly went with that story, because his ambitious defense case rested on the contention that actually a bomb had not blown up the LA Times building at all. Instead, the building just did that, because the gas pipes spontaneously combusted. This is obviously false, although from what I understand, it wasn't exactly unusual for these kinds of accidents to happen in early 20th century cities. The public could pretty easily be convinced of that. He also managed to use the prosecution's greatest strength against them. We mentioned that it was a pretty strange coincidence that Detective William Burns had found a bomb just like the one used in Los Angeles way back in Peoria, Illinois. According to Darrow, this wasn't a coincidence, it was a lie. Evidence of collusion to fabricate evidence to implicate several guilty men. They were just waiting for some kind of random accident that they could pin on the unions.
Right. We know in retrospect that this was a totally bogus claim, but it was convincing, and it wasn't that much more underhanded than the kinds of tactics that the prosecutor Earl Rogers was notorious for. Darrow also took advantage of the upswell in public support for the defendants by paying men to print buttons, organize parades, and even begin producing a silent short film in support for his 3 clients. It was called A Martyr for His Cause, and it depicted J.J. McNamara as an innocent man who was being framed by the interests of capital. And fun fact, this was also the first film to be produced entirely by unionized labor.
That's great. I know. And, it's funny, a little note here is that, the whole context of this episode is about the unionization drive in California. Although at this time, Los Angeles was probably the least unionized city in the state of California. Today, due to the presence of the film industry, Los Angeles actually has quite a high union density because film is totally unionized. And this one, Martyr for His Cause, totally paved the way. Tragically, this film is lost. I would love to see it, but from what we understand, it was a miniature, 10-minute biopic of JJ's life. First showing him as a teenager leaving home, kissing his mother, and promising to be a good boy. Just like, she told the journalist she knew he was. JJ starts off working as an ironworker, then joins the union and begins rising through the ranks as a secretary. But then one day he is suddenly and cruelly arrested on false charges of planting a bomb thousands of miles away in California, and he must languish in a jail cell for a crime he didn't commit.
As Irwin recounted, quote, "The film then shows detectives led by a fat mustachioed chief breaking into union headquarters while its leaders are holding a regular meeting and then spiriting away John McNamara to a jail cell across the country. Historian Philip Foner, that is the uncle of the famous contemporary historian Eric Foner, managed to find a copy of the screenplay. It ends with a letter supposedly written by JJ himself, telling the organized labor movement not to worry over his false imprisonment because surely the truth will win out."
Right, and this film hit the McNamara's hometown Cincinnati during the very same week that JB's trial opened in California. Although we should mention that JB, who in fact planted the bomb, barely received a mention in the film. It was all about JJ, the more sympathetic, clean-cut guy. Apparently, the film drew 50,000 people during the 6 days that it played in Cincinnati. The specially designed tickets were sold for 5 cents apiece, with 4 of those cents going to the McNamara Defense Fund. Posters for the movie showed a near-naked J.J. McNamara wearing a loincloth and holding a sword, while cannons labeled vindictiveness, politics, money, and intolerance took aim at his body. See the only original moving picture of the McNamaras, including their history and the actual scenes of the arrest, the poster said. Which lets you know that even in those days, movie posters were not to be trusted.
That's great. They just got a left-wing Ben Garrison up in there doing his thing.
Following this optimistic mood, the next day the 3 men were arraigned in LA. JJ and JB McNamara pled not guilty, but Ordy McManigal was not charged at all because he had essentially become an asset of the prosecution, a snitch. As far as he could tell, this was the best way to protect his family.
Clarence Darrow was convinced that they had a solid case on their hands and that his great public relations campaign, along with the clear misconduct on the part of Burns and Rogers, would be enough to sway the jury. But there was one rusty link in the chain that kept him up that night. That rusty link was J.B. McNamara. Unlike the very professional J.J., J.B. did not have a reputation for a strong will or calmness under pressure. Moreover, he knew that he was one of the ones who had actually set the bomb. The deaths of those 19 people lay at his feet more than at anybody else's. Darrow feared that under cross-examination, J.B. would crack and confess that he had set the bomb, pleading forgiveness from God and the judge and the jury. Instead, something else happened entirely. A muckraking journalist named Lincoln Steffens managed to get himself into the case. He was a proud socialist who would later go on to report on the Mexican Revolution and soon afterwards witness the Soviet Revolution in Russia. If you've ever taken a Soviet history class, you might know his famous statement upon returning to California. Quote, "I have seen the future, and it works." The pot containing all of the ingredients for a great revolutionary wave had not yet boiled over, but it was beginning to bubble, and Lincoln Steffens wanted in.
Right, so he came down to LA to meet the accused, interested in hearing their side of the story. And just as Clarence Darrow had feared, J.B. McNamara broke down, confessing that he had set the bomb. He just never intended to hurt anybody. His brother J.J. was furious at this, fearing that they had just lost their best shot at freedom. But Steffens convinced him that they should stick to the truth, because he had a very bold idea. They could convince the American people on the strength of their moral position, not on their legal standing, even if it meant facing the death penalty. Because surely Americans would understand that the condition of labor was so bad in this country that maybe killing 20 people in a bombing attack was actually okay. After this confession, though, Darrow reluctantly accepted that they had to find a new case. He totally abandoned the claims of a conspiracy to defame and falsely accuse these three men, instead saying that, following Steffens, this bomb was justified in response to the brutal and oftentimes violent coercion of organized labor across Los Angeles. Darrow was smart enough, though, to know that middle-class jurors wouldn't be convinced by that. His best case, therefore, was some kind of guilty plea. So he secretly sent Steffens to meet with Harry Chandler, the editor of the LA Times, who, how we mentioned, had married into the Otis dynasty. During these negotiations, Steffens actually managed to convince Chandler and his father-in-law, General Otis, to go easy on the accused. Not, however, by appealing to their conscience, but by explaining that if these three men were killed or spent their lives in prison, this conviction would ignite an even more violent revolutionary wave that could destroy the entire city of Los Angeles.
But Otis and Chandler ultimately could not decide the sentence. The county of Los Angeles was in charge here, and they refused any concessions to the accused except for deciding that only J.B. McNamara, and not his accomplices, deserved life in prison. And so Darrow returned to his defendants with the terms. In an act of shocking and admirable grace, J.B. accepted life imprisonment if it meant that his brother would one day be free. The biggest roadblock to the plea was actually Samuel Gompers. The AFL was furious at the thought that the men could accept their guilt, because this would defame the entire labor movement and reverse the enormous PR gains made in the last couple of months. All parties were set to walk into the court and finalize this plea deal privately. But there were two more shoes to drop. Mayor George Alexander was currently engaged in a re-election campaign with Job Harriman, who was an open socialist whose success had been buoyed by the mass support for the McNamaras. Harriman had also taken a role for the defense, even though his actual input was minimal. Instead, George Alexander's government demanded an open admission of guilt that they hoped would defame Job Harriman and secure the incumbent's re-election. And election week was by this point less than a week away. Backed into a corner, Clarence Darrow made one final last-ditch effort to protect his client. It was an effort that would end up bringing a permanent taint to his legacy. He was caught bribing jurors, a crime that would surely lead to a mistrial today, but in 1910 it just had the effect of terribly tarnishing his reputation, and as well as that of the labor movement. He would later be tried for this, and he got very weepy in the courtroom, as he knew how to do because he's just a simple country lawyer, etc., etc.
Yeah, so J.B. and J.J. McNamara formally pled guilty. The same day they put in their guilty plea, the film A Martyr for His Cause was pulled from circulation. In their pleas, the two men acknowledged that they had in fact planted the bombs, but denied that they had ever wrenched open any gas pipes or had any indication that this bombing could be deadly. J.B. would confess, "I, James B. McNamara, having heretofore pled guilty to the crime of murder, desire to make this statement of facts. On the night of September 30th, 1910, at 5:45 p.m., I placed in Ink Alley, a proportion of the Times building, a suitcase containing 16 sticks of 80% dynamite, set to explode at 1 o'clock the next morning. It was my intention to injure the building and scare the owners. I sincerely regret that these unfortunate men lost their lives. If the giving of my life would bring them back, I would gladly give it. In fact, in pleading guilty to murder in the first degree, I have placed my life in the hands of the state."
The judge was really unconvinced by the claim that they never intended to hurt anybody. He went so far as to claim that JB, quote, must have been a murderer at heart.
And so, JB was sentenced to spend the rest of his life at San Quentin, with JJ given 15 years. In his sentencing, the judge made sure to mention his contempt for both Clarence Darrow and Lincoln Steffens, especially in their attempt to organize a kind of private plea deal with Chandler and Otis. J.J. McNamara's last words as a free man were to Steffens, the guy who'd convinced him to make a guilty plea. "You see, I was right and you were
Upon
wrong.
hearing the news, Samuel Gompers was livid and immediately made a statement condemning the McNamara's as violent agitators who'd betrayed the labor movement. Meanwhile, radicals like Olaf Tveitmo and Emma Goldman never forgave Lincoln Steffens for his naive appeal to the empathy of the judge and the jury. When Steffens said he thought he could win because of the so-called golden rule, that workers did not deserve to be treated so poorly, Olaf spat that, quote, "There is no golden rule, there is only rule by gold."
That's a pretty cold line, I gotta say.
Yeah.
Yeah. JJ would fortunately only serve 10 of his 15-year sentence, but his brother JB would in fact spend the rest of his life behind bars. He sent letters from prison championing the news of outbreak of revolution in Russia and Germany, the end of World War I. He mourned the death of Vladimir Lenin in 1924. JB himself would die during World War II of a painful cancer. His only consolation in the end of his life were regular visits from Lincoln Steffens, who clearly felt guilty for his inability to protect these men. Just 2 months after learning about JB's death, J.J. McNamara would himself die in Montana, where he'd been living for the past 20 years. No longer a well-heeled Union man, but a lowly drifter. Herbert Hawken was disgraced after being revealed as a longtime mole of the capitalists. But whatever prize he got for that treachery has been lost to history. For other guys, Matthew Schmitty, remained active in radical politics. He evaded arrest for the next several years, traveling across the country, and eventually conducted a lone wolf bombing attack in New York, for which he was arrested. Orny McManigal would testify against him in the ensuing trial of Schmitty, as well as his friend David Kaplan. Both those two guys were both sent to San Quentin, like the McNamaras.
Darrows and Steffens had to rebuild their reputations after this defeat. Darrows, of course, reached his greatest fame in defending the teaching of evolution against William Jennings Bryan 14 years later, but immediately after losing the McNamara case, he had to defend himself against those bribery charges. Darrow's lawyer was, in fact, Earl Rogers, the same guy who had just helped to beat him in court. Rogers' assistant was a 25-year-old from Iowa named Jerry Giesler, who didn't have a law degree. This guy Giesler was essential in helping Darrow beat the bribery charges. Darrow offered him a job at his own law firm, but Giesler chose to stay in California. This maybe had something to do with the fact that in any other state he would have to get a law degree to practice law.
Yeah. We mentioned Joe Harriman, the socialist. He would unfortunately lose the election campaign against the right-wing Mayor Alexander several days after the trial. But in 1913, he would try again and also fail. He would declaim the entire city of Los Angeles as a lost cause and lead a group of followers out into the desert to establish the utopian colony of Llano del Rio. After 4 years and the loss of many members to the World War I draft, this too would fail. He would return with his tail between his legs back to LA, and really hardcore members of the commune would attempt to relocate to Louisiana, where they would stay for another 20 years.
As for Orty McManigal, the bomb maker pulled into this by the traitor Herb Hawken, had one of the saddest fates over the course of the trial, but long term he made out pretty okay. In the lead up to the trial, Darrow attempted to do all he could to get him to recant his confession and to claim that he had only made it under duress. This would sow further doubt in the case, which was rock solid in terms of evidence, but incredibly sleazy from the beginning, as we saw. To that effect, he brought McManigal's family over to LA and recruited Emma McManigal to get her husband to recant, but he remained steadfast, even when she threatened to leave him if he continued on his path. His wife's tears would not be enough to budge him, however. When that failed, Darrow told McManigal's uncle to take walks with his son in an area visible from his cell window, while refusing to allow him to actually talk to his son. Once again, lots of really sleazy stuff going on up and down. But McManigal, he would only be sentenced to a year in jail, and he spent much of that time traveling across the country to testify at the trials of other union officials. A few years after he was released from jail, an LA Times reporter discovered that his wife and children were once again living with him. A portrait of the pair was run in the Times with the caption, "Dynamiter's wife his own again." He made a decent chunk of money from the book that he wrote in the aftermath recounting his involvement with the affair, which was one of the major sources of Lou Irwin's Deadly Times. And again, this is probably a somewhat dubious source, just because McManigal is the one who claimed that JB had intentionally sabotaged the gas pipes to make the explosion even deadlier. And of course, he was all about crafting an image of himself as this sort of immaculate saint as opposed to the dastardly McNamaras.
Yeah, and something I find kind of revealing about Lou Irwin is that the fact that McManigal turned against the Union to help convict the McNamara brothers, that makes him a hero in the eyes of Lou Irwin, which I think that a more sympathetic, more labor sympathetic historian might not feel that way.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, let me quote you guys directly what he has to say, because it's really over the top. It is ironic that if there is any hero of this tale, it is Ordie McManigal, the man responsible for carrying out a relentless campaign of industrial sabotage unlike any other in history, but who nevertheless had the courage in the end to say no more. God, this man is just addicted to both citing it, like all through the book. It was a really frustrating experience. But going back to McManigal, he earned a decent amount of money from the book that he wrote, and he was able to buy some land in Honduras. And he spent the remainder of his life, he wasn't exactly living it up, but he lived pretty comfortably. In the final 12 years of his life, he would work as a security guard for one of the targets that he had been instructed to bomb earlier.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned both sides. I think now we have to look at the other side, because as a result of the conviction of the McNamara brothers, capital in Los Angeles was triumphant. They had the unions under their heel. And, although there would be an echo of the, revolutionary wave caused by these men's conviction that had been suggested by Steffens, it was nothing they couldn't crush. And until the rise of the New Deal 20 years later, labor in LA was on the back foot. General Otis would die a happy man in 1917, just weeks after the U.S. entry into World War I. His son-in-law, Harry Chandler, would probably become the most powerful man in all of Los Angeles in the ensuing generation. He would live to see the transition of Los Angeles from a dusty cowtown into America's second city, a massive metropolis overlooking the Pacific. He would maintain his support for eugenics while walking back his father-in-law's more explicit white supremacy. He would also make a lot of money investing in Mexico, especially after the Mexican Revolution, when they wanted more American investment. And he used this to build ties with the large and long-maligned Latino community of LA. He also paid for many of the public works projects across Los Angeles, including the USC area, like the USC Coliseum. But his most famous project would certainly be developing Hollywoodland, an area now called the Hollywood Hills. Everyone listening to this podcast knows the Hollywood sign. That's all Harry Chandler. He built that sign, and he built the Hollywood Hills in hopes of attracting a new kind of settler to Los Angeles. Not troublesome immigrants who could, agitate for union labor, but instead middle-class white Protestants. There would be a very successful demographic transition in Los Angeles under this mold, as large numbers of middle-class white people, especially from the Midwest, moved to Los Angeles across the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. I think this means that LA is probably the only American city to become less ethnically diverse across the first half of the 20th century. The fact that these people were middle class and had cars meant that Los Angeles would take a very unique character, which still marks the physical and political landscape of this town today. And I'm mentioning all of this because I think that this trial in 1910 really was an essential turning point in California history. It was this great cataclysmic battle between labor and capital, and labor lost. It was the victory of the open shop policy, which effectively rendered unionization illegal in Los Angeles. We also need to mention, that we talked about how, as part of the propaganda in support of the McNamaras, a movie was created. Immediately after this trial, Los Angeles began to emerge as the center of American filmmaking. Hollywood was just beginning to start up, and a new labor-free vision of California would be broadcast in American movie theaters across the country.
Yeah, and many of the figures involved in this trial would, in fact, go on to make a name for themselves in Hollywood. Although the hotshot lawyer during the trial, Earl Rogers, would die in 1922, no doubt brought to an early grave by his love of drink, his assistant, Jerry Giesler, would become the preeminent lawyer in Hollywood's golden age, defending Errol Flynn against a very credible rape accusation and the famous mobster Bugsy Siegel against murder accusations. Astute Gladio listeners will already know one of Giesler's cases. This was the investigation into whether the Superman actor George Reeves was in fact murdered by Eddie Mannix, the Hollywood fixture portrayed in the movie Hail Caesar, which we covered back in February.
And according to Irwin, Giesler has also entered movies and TV in another way, because his friendship with writer Earl Stanley Gardner led to the creation of the famous TV lawyer Perry Mason. There's a remake right now on HBO. This character is a fictional, very effective lawyer who is based not on Jerry Giesler, but on his mentor, Earl Rogers. And, we spoke about the kind of middle-class car culture that emerged in the wake of this. And just kind of as a closing thought here, Mike Davis is just an incredible historian of the United States, of labor, and of Los Angeles in particular. And he sees LA as a place where the blueprint of the later 20th century was effectively drawn out. The suburbanization you'd see in the 50s and 60s was happening in LA in the 20s. And I think it's really in no small part due to the defeat of organized labor. We talked last episode about how there was the San Francisco model and there was the Los Angeles model. In San Francisco, capital tolerated the presence of labor, just as capital did in New York or Chicago, even if reluctantly. In Los Angeles, there was no toleration whatsoever. Usually that kind of policy had failed. But somehow the capitalists in Los Angeles held it out. And I think that this unique victory had far-reaching ramifications for the development of class politics, of urban geography, the idea that everyone can own a car, that would really be felt all across America. And that's why I think that although the villains, in my opinion, of this story, the capitalists, their victories in the short term, their ideas about race, about eugenics, would not take permanent root in America. Those would be walked back. I think that many of their other ideas about labor, about home ownership, about the role of the working class in American society would basically be taken for granted. And that's why I think that this story about the McNamara brothers and this episode is really important for understanding where we are today in American history. This is a new moment of labor upheaval. And I think that you gotta wonder if there are any lessons from this period, or are there any indications of where things might go next?
Well, I'd say that so much has changed in the last century in terms of surveillance that something like what McManigal pulled off and McNamara would just be impossible today, frankly. I don't think it's really...
Yeah, everybody's got everyone with a cell phone has a her pocket in their pocket.
And the surveillance net is just encompassing us further and further, and I don't really know, what's to come. I'd hazard to venture a guess, but the tactics that were useful back in those days, they may not be applicable today, but what is applicable, I'd say, is this deep sense of solidarity that was felt by a large chunk of Americans looking at the McNamara trial, who believed that this was a matter of class struggle, and we really need to revive that mindset if we hope to get anywhere. But I don't know. I've just been thinking about these kinds of questions lately. How does one actually re-engineer a culture of mass politics in an era when that's dead in the waters from where I stand? And I don't have any answers for you guys yet, but stay tuned. Maybe someday we'll have a Gladio Free Empire going and fighting all the important labor battles.
Yeah, you never know. Yeah. But yeah, just definitely this, gives you a lot to think about. I think that the figure who might actually stand out most, who just kind of walks in at the end, is that guy, Lincoln Steffens. Irwin sees him as very naive for thinking he could appeal to the conscience of the judge and the jury about the brutalities of capital against labor, and saying that even though this bombing seems terrifying, if you put yourself in these men's shoes, you understand it. And I agree he was naive for thinking that strategy would work. Of course it wouldn't. It's the whole thing about, Olaf Tvimo said, there is no golden rule. There's only the rule by gold. I think that in this context, Tvimo was completely correct. But I also think that in this context, many people outside that courtroom would have agreed. And that's why this episode is also a window into a time when there really was mass American solidarity that often, but not always, but often crossed lines of geography and gender and race, and even lines of class. There were a lot of middle-class people who supported people like Clarence Darrow, who supported this movement. Eventually, due to things like the first Red Scare in 1919, the second Red Scare in the 50s would completely eradicate that kind of solidarity in America. But I think that enough time has passed that this could maybe come again. Maybe we just got to start making 10-minute short films about accused labor agitators again. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I'm down if anyone's looking to make a short film about, your long struggles against status quo. Please reach out to us, and we'll be sure to give you a platform once our production company is set up.
All right. Well, I think that has been Gladio Free Europe for this week. I know it was a little bit of a break before this episode, but we'll be back very soon with some new stuff. I think this will be our last contemporary American episode in a while, because we're going back to the ancient past pretty soon. We got something pretty cool cooking up that I'm excited to share with you guys. But this has been Gladio Free Europe signing off. Hope you enjoy it.
Bye-bye.